broken cowboy hid from the world until an Apache woman arrived on a dying horse. Cade Walker had always been a man of the land. The cowboy was once known far and wide for his skill with horses and his sharp aim. He had been a man of honor, respected by the people around him. But now, those days seemed like a distant dream. Cade had retreated to the quietest corner of the world, the barren desert. Here the land stretched endlessly in all directions, dry and empty, much like his heart. The wind blew through the cracked earth, carrying the dust of 1,000 forgotten memories. Cade stood at the door of his small cabin, staring out into the wide open space. The silence around him was both a comfort and a curse. It was a place where no one could find him, a place where he could hide from the world. His old life seemed like another world, a time before the pain had settled deep in his chest. Cade had once been a proud man with a loving wife and children. They had lived on a small ranch just outside a town that was barely more than a handful of buildings. But that was before the fire, before the storm, before everything changed. The fire had taken his wife, and the storm had taken his children. It wasn't nature that had caused the destruction, though. It was his own hands. Cade had always prided himself on being able to protect those he loved. But the day the fire had broken out, he had been too far away. By the time he reached home, it was already too late. The wind had stolen the smoke, and there was nothing left but the memories of what had been. For days, Cade had searched through the wreckage, hoping against hope that his family had somehow survived. But there was no sign of them, and with no sign, there was no hope left for him. He couldn't stay. He couldn't face the town, couldn't look at the faces of people who still remembered the man he used to be. So he packed his things and left. The desert became his home, the place where the wind never stopped howling and the sun never rested. But even here, in the silence, the ghosts of the past never left him. Each night as he lay on his cot, he would see their faces, hear their voices. His wife's laughter, his children's calls, the sound of their footsteps running through the house. It was late one evening when Cade first saw her. He had been sitting outside his cabin, sipping whiskey and watching the sunset. The desert stretched out before him, a canvas of red and orange, painted with the fading light. It was the time of day when the air cooled, and the land seemed to breathe a little easier. That's when he heard the soft thud of hooves. Cade's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his side. The sound was faint at first, almost like a whisper. But it grew louder, closer. He stood up slowly, peering into the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight barely touched the earth. And there, just at the edge of his vision, he saw it. A horse, staggering through the dust, its sides heaving. At first he thought the horse was alone, but as it came closer, Cade saw the woman. She was slumped over the horse's back, her body barely holding onto the reins. The horse stumbled forward, its legs shaky, as if it had been riding for days without rest. The woman's dark hair was matted with sweat, her face pale beneath a layer of dirt. Without thinking, Cade rushed forward, his boots crunching in the dry sand. He reached the horse just as it collapsed, its legs giving way beneath it. The woman slid off its back, falling to the ground with a soft thud. Cade caught her just in time, his hands steady as he lowered her gently to the earth. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold to the touch. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open only for a moment before closing again. Cade glanced at the horse. It was badly hurt, but there was no time to tend to it now. His focus shifted to the woman in his arms. She was clearly in trouble. There was no telling how long she had been traveling or what had happened to her. Her clothing was torn, her boots worn down to the soles. But it was the look in her eyes that struck him the most. There was a kind of desperation there mixed with fear and determination. "Who are you?" Cade asked, his voice rough, unused to talking to anyone in months. But she didn't respond. Instead, she gave a weak cough, followed by a faint whisper. "Help." Cade hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. He wasn't a doctor. He didn't know anything about healing wounds or tending to the sick. But he knew what it meant to be in need. He knew what it felt like to have no one around to help. Without another thought, Cade picked her up gently, holding her close as he made his way back to the cabin. He wasn't sure how he would help her, but he knew he couldn't leave her out here in the desert to die alone. Once inside, Cade laid her on his cot, quickly covering her with an old blanket. He moved around the cabin in a blur, gathering what little supplies he had. He wasn't used to taking care of someone, but he had no choice now. The woman needed him, whether she knew it or not. The night stretched on as Cade worked by the light of a single lantern. He wasn't sure if she would survive, but he had to try. As he tended to her wounds, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? What was she doing out here alone in the middle of nowhere? And why had she come to him? For the first time in months, Cade felt something stir in his chest. A spark of hope. A spark of life. He could have turned her away, could have left her to fend for herself, but something deep inside told him that helping her was his chance at redemption. Helping her might be the one thing that could bring him back from the darkness he had been hiding in for so long. As Cade sat by her side, watching over her through the long hours of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger than both of them. Something that would force him to confront the past he had been running from. The wind howled outside the same way it always had. But this time, it didn't sound as lonely. The early morning sun filtered through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls, casting long shadows across the floor. Cade sat in his chair, his eyes on the woman who lay on his cot. She had been unconscious all through the night, her breathing shallow but steady. He had watched over her, tending to her as best as he could with the little he knew. Now, as the first light of day touched the desert, Cade found himself feeling a strange sense of responsibility for this woman, a responsibility he had not felt in years. He had once been a man of honor. Once, he had stood strong beside his family, working hard to make a life. But that man was long gone, buried under the weight of regret. Now all he had was the land and the quiet of the desert, a place where no one could find him. But this woman, she had come to him, collapsed at his doorstep, and now he couldn't ignore her. The air in the cabin was warm, but it was the weight of the silence that Cade found the hardest to bear. He had always been alone in this place, but her presence, though unconscious, filled the space in ways he wasn't used to. He didn't know why she had come here, to his lonely cabin in the middle of nowhere. She had called out for help, and that was enough for him to take her in. But now that she was here, questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? Why had she been riding alone in the desert on a dying horse? And what had brought her to him? Cade rose from his chair, the creak of the wooden floor breaking the silence. He walked to the small window and peered out into the vast desert. The horizon was a blur of dusty earth and sky, stretching endlessly in every direction. He had spent years out here hiding from the world, but now it felt as though the world was finding its way back to him. The woman stirred on the cot. Cade turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she seemed confused, as if unsure of where she was. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "Hey there," Cade said softly, moving to her side. His voice was rough but gentle. "You're safe. You're at my cabin." She blinked, her dark eyes meeting his. "Where?" she began, her voice hoarse. "You're in the desert," Cade explained, taking a step back to give her space. "You passed out. I brought you inside. You've been hurt." A flicker of recognition crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something Cade couldn't read. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, almost in a whisper, "Ayanna." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Ayanna," he repeated. "That's your name?" The woman nodded slowly. Her breathing was still shallow, but her eyes were sharp now, watching him carefully. She tried to sit up, but the effort was too much. She winced and fell back onto the cot, a soft gasp escaping her lips. Cade moved quickly, his hand on her shoulder to steady her. "You need to rest," he said, his tone firm but kind. "You've been through a lot. Let me get you some water." Ayanna's gaze followed him as he moved to a small wooden table near the window. He had only a few supplies in his cabin. Water, some dried meat, a few grains of corn. It wasn't much, but it had been enough to keep him alive out here in the wilderness. As Cade filled a cup with water, Ayanna's voice stopped him. "The horse, where is it?" she asked, her voice weak. Cade looked at her, surprised. "The horse didn't make it," he said softly. "It collapsed before you did. I couldn't save it. I had to get here. I had to reach the man they told me about." Cade frowned, confused. "The man they told you about?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Ayanna opened her eyes and looked at him, her expression serious. "You," she said simply. "You're the one who can help us. You're the one they said would protect us." Cade felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. He was no protector. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore. The thought of being someone's hero felt like a cruel joke. He was just a man hiding from his past, a man who had failed those he loved. "I don't know what you mean," Cade replied slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just a cowboy. I don't fight for causes anymore. I can't protect anyone." Ayanna's eyes searched his face, studying him as if trying to understand his words. "You don't have to protect anyone," she said softly, "but you can help." You have the skills. You know how to fight, and I need you now. Cade shook his head, stepping back from the bed. I've done enough fighting in my time. I'm not the man you think I am, he said, his voice filled with regret. Ayanna reached out weakly, her hand brushing against his. Cade paused, looking down at her hand on his. There was something in her touch, a desperation, a need. She was asking him for something he wasn't sure he could give. Please, Ayanna whispered, I can't do this alone. My people, they're in danger. We're being hunted, and I don't know how much longer we can survive. Cade's heart ached at her words. He could see the fear in her eyes, the weight of the burden she carried. He could feel it in the way she spoke, as though the very life of her people depended on his decision. He looked at her, his mind racing. He had been running from his past for so long, hiding from the pain, hiding from the world. But now, this woman, this Apache warrior, had come to him. She needed him. And for the first time in years, Cade felt something stir deep inside him, something more than just the hollow ache of loss. He felt the stirrings of something that had been long buried, hope. I'll help you, Cade said, his voice steady now. But we'll do this my way. I can't promise you much, but I'll get you to your people. And we'll see what we can do. Ayanna nodded, a small smile appearing on her face. Thank you, she whispered. Cade nodded in return, his heart heavy but resolute. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of responsibility, not for himself, but for someone else. And perhaps, for the first time, that was enough. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the land as Cade and Ayanna prepared to leave the cabin. The small place that had been Cade's refuge for so long now felt too cramped, too alive with the presence of someone else. He wasn't sure what had drawn him to help her, but there was something about Ayanna, something about her strength and her need, that stirred something inside him. Are you sure about this? Cade asked, packing the last of his supplies into his saddlebag. His voice was gruff, but there was an edge of uncertainty. He hadn't been on a real journey in years, let alone one that involved fighting to protect someone else. Ayanna stood near the door of the cabin, her posture straight and her gaze fixed on the horizon. The fire that had burned in her eyes the night before had not faded. It had only grown stronger. She was ready for whatever came next. I'm sure, Ayanna replied, her voice steady. My people are waiting for me. We need to reach them before it's too late. Cade paused, his hands stilling as he adjusted his gear. The weight of the decision hung heavy on his shoulders. He had never intended to be a part of something larger than himself. The desert had been a refuge, a place where he could escape from the memories that haunted him. But now, with Ayanna at his side, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of responsibility that had started to take root in his heart. The two of them stepped outside, the dry desert air pressing against their skin. Cade's old horse, a sturdy creature with a worn saddle, stood tethered to a post nearby. Ayanna's horse, the one that had barely made it to his cabin the day before, had been laid to rest under the shade of a nearby tree. Cade had buried the animal himself out of respect. It was the least he could do. I'll take the lead, Cade said, offering Ayanna a hand to help her onto his horse. Ayanna shook her head, her expression unreadable. I don't need help. I can ride, she said, her voice firm. Cade didn't argue. He wasn't used to women who spoke with such confidence, and he admired it. Ayanna's strength was evident in the way she held herself, even when her body still showed signs of the exhaustion from her journey. She had been through so much, and yet she stood tall, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The two of them set off across the vast, empty desert. Cade knew the land better than most. He had spent years navigating these desolate plains, learning its secrets, understanding its rhythms. But this time the journey was different. This time there was more at stake than just survival. As they rode, Ayanna spoke little, but Cade could tell her mind was racing with thoughts of her people. She had told him of the tribe she came from, the Apache, and how they had been hunted for years by a group of mercenaries. These men, hired by unknown forces, had been chasing the Apache across the land, determined to wipe them out. Ayanna had been sent to find help, and she had come to Cade because she believed he could offer it. Cade didn't know how much help he could be. He was just one man after all. But as they rode, the weight of Ayanna's words settled on him, and he began to feel something stir inside him. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was his chance to redeem himself for the mistakes of his past. After several days of travel, they reached the edge of the desert, where the land began to change. The dry, cracked earth softened into green, rolling hills, and the first signs of life appeared. Small shrubs, patches of grass, and distant mountains on the horizon. Cade felt a slight relief in his chest as they approached more familiar territory. The vast emptiness of the desert had weighed on him, and now the promise of something more felt like a breath of fresh air, but the relief was short-lived. They had camped by a stream that night, setting up a small fire. Ayanna had insisted on keeping watch, even though Cade tried to tell her that they were safe for the moment. But she wouldn't hear it. She was determined to stay alert, knowing that the mercenaries who hunted her tribe were never far behind. The night was quiet, save for the sounds of the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Cade sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in thought. His mind wandered back to his own past, to the life he had left behind. He had been a protector once, a man who stood strong in the face of danger. But that man had died with his family. Cade wasn't sure who he was anymore, only that he was no longer the man he used to be. Suddenly, Ayanna's voice cut through the silence. "They're coming," she said, her tone low but urgent. Cade stood instantly, his senses on high alert. His hand instinctively went to the revolver at his side. He looked into the distance but saw nothing. The night was too dark, the shadows too deep. "Are you sure?" Cade asked, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Ayanna nodded, her eyes narrowed as she scanned the surroundings. "I can feel them," she said. "They've been tracking me for days. They won't stop until they find us." He knew this day would come. He had expected it. But now that it was here, he didn't know what to do. They were outnumbered and the odds were stacked against them. But Cade had never been one to back down from a fight. "We need to move now," Cade said, grabbing his things and rushing to his horse. Ayanna was already mounted, her posture straight, her eyes focused on the darkness ahead. The two of them moved quickly, riding through the night with no clear destination. Cade led the way, his mind racing. He knew the desert better than anyone, but this was different. They were being hunted, and they couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they rode through the night, Cade's thoughts were filled with the realization that he couldn't run anymore. He couldn't hide from his past, nor could he hide from what was happening now. He had to face it. Face the mercenaries, face the danger, and face the man he had become. In the distance, the faint glow of campfires flickered on the horizon. The mercenaries were closing in, but Cade wasn't ready to give up just yet. He had one chance, one shot at redemption, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The night had settled heavy over the desert, a blanket of darkness that pressed down on Cade and Ayanna as they rode fast through the rough terrain. The horses' hooves beat against the earth, their breath coming in sharp gasps as the sound of pursuit grew closer. Cade could hear the thundering of riders behind them, their shadows stretching long across the sand as they closed in. "Keep moving," Cade shouted to Ayanna, his voice urgent. "We've got to get to higher ground. We'll have the advantage there." Ayanna's dark eyes flicked back toward him for a brief moment before she nodded. She was exhausted, the weariness of the past days pulling at her, but she didn't slow, urging her horse forward with quiet determination. The mercenaries were closing in fast, their campfires visible now on the horizon, flickering like small flames in a storm. Cade didn't know how many there were, but he knew they were well-armed and ruthless. They had hunted Ayanna's tribe for far too long, and now they had found her. He had promised her that he would help. He had promised himself that he would not turn his back again, but as the sound of the enemy's approach grew louder, Cade felt the old fear rise in his chest. He wasn't the man he used to be. He wasn't a hero, a leader, or a warrior. He was just a broken man barely holding on to the past. But Ayanna's voice cut through the doubt that threatened to overwhelm him. "We can do this," she said, her words quiet but strong. "We have to." He couldn't fail her now. He couldn't run from this fight. They rode hard until they reached the base of a steep hill, the rocky cliffs rising in jagged layers before them. The horses stumbled over the uneven ground, but Cade urged them on, knowing that the high ground would give them a chance to defend themselves. At the top of the hill, Cade stopped and turned to Ayanna, who was breathing heavily but still holding her ground. He reached for his revolver, checking it for the third time. It was all he had, and though it wasn't much, he knew how to use it. "Stay close," he said. "We fight together." Ayanna didn't respond with words, but the look she gave him was enough. She was ready. The fight was upon them. The first of the mercenaries reached the base of the hill just as Cade and Ayanna took position behind a large rock. Cade's eyes scanned the area, his heart beating fast. The mercenaries were on horseback, their weapons drawn, their faces hard with determination. They had been hunting her for days, and now they were here to finish what they had started. Cade's grip tightened on his revolver as the first rider crested the hill, his horse's hooves kicking up dust. Ayanna's sharp eyes never left him. The moment the mercenary came into range, she raised her bow, letting an arrow fly with deadly precision. It struck the rider in the chest, and the man fell from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The other mercenaries didn't hesitate. They charged forward, shouting in anger. Cade fired his revolver, the sound of the gunshot splitting the air. The bullet found its mark, and another mercenary fell, his body crumpling to the ground. Ayanna was quick with her arrows, her movements graceful and sure. Cade watched in awe as she took down another rider, her aim true. But there were too many of them. For every mercenary that fell, 2 more took their place. "Fall back!" Cade shouted. "We need more cover." The 2 of them retreated higher up the hill, ducking behind a large rock outcropping. Cade's heart raced in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wasn't used to this kind of fight anymore. He wasn't used to working with someone else. But Ayanna moved like an extension of himself, her movements in sync with his own. Another rider came charging at them, his rifle aimed straight at Cade. Cade dove to the side, the bullet passing just inches from his face. He rolled to his feet and fired again, the shot catching the rider in the shoulder. The man screamed, falling from his horse, his rifle skittering across the ground. Ayanna was already moving again, her bow drawn, her face set with determination. She shot another arrow, taking down another mercenary. But there were too many of them. They had surrounded them on all sides. "We need to do something," Ayanna said, her voice urgent. Cade glanced around, his mind racing. There had to be a way out of this, a way to turn the tide. He wasn't ready to die here, not like this. And he wouldn't let Ayanna die, not after everything they had been through. "There's a canyon to the north," he said quickly. "We can make a run for it. If we get there, we'll have cover." Ayanna nodded, her eyes never leaving the enemy. "On 3, she said. Cade counted in his head, his heart thundering in his chest. 1, 2, 3! The 2 of them bolted, running through the dust and chaos, dodging bullets and arrows. Cade's mind was a blur of movement and instinct. They made it to the edge of the hill and started down the slope toward the canyon, but the mercenaries were already in pursuit. It was close. Too close. Cade and Ayanna reached the canyon's edge just as the mercenaries were almost upon them. Ayanna drew her bow one last time, her arrow flying straight into the chest of the leader of the mercenaries. He fell from his horse, his body crumpling to the ground. Cade fired his revolver once more, taking down another rider, but the rest of the mercenaries hesitated, unsure of whether to follow. It was enough. The remaining mercenaries turned and fled, their horses galloping back down the hill away from the canyon. Cade and Ayanna stood there, their chests heaving with exhaustion, their eyes scanning the horizon. They had won, but at what cost? Ayanna turned to Cade, her face grim but relieved. "We did it," she said softly. Cade nodded, his breath still coming in sharp gasps. "Yeah, we did." For a moment, neither of them said anything. They simply stood together, 2 survivors in the quiet aftermath of the battle. The desert stretched before them, silent and unforgiving, but for the first time in years, Cade didn't feel alone. The past was behind him, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had found the man he had been searching for.